And I would say I love provocative, edgy questions. So while we're talking, this is your chance to get things
Let it rip.
going. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's start with maybe the more background kind of
Less
stuff.
provocative.
Yeah, somewhat less. Well, we'll find out.
Okay, we'll find out. Yeah.
So you started here and then you made your way to Netflix. What were some of the moments in between? I know you had a lot of interest in coding. You spent some time in just straight tech for a while. Maybe you can just elaborate on what your path was.
Sure. So I studied physics and astronomy here. I was on a Air Force ROTC scholarship, so they enabled me to come here. And as a result, I spent 5 years with them afterwards. I did 2 big projects. One was global positioning system, building the next generation of those satellites. And then worked for the National Reconnaissance Office doing satellite operations and R&D for Intelsats. And then I did 1 year in commercial satellites, so ComSats, as a transition. And then I got essentially the main thing that I knew how to do was software development at that point in time. This was sort of the lead up to the dot-com boom. So I did a bunch of startups. I did a startup that was called wine.com, which was selling wine online, and learned a lot about how not to build companies in a huge bubble area. That might be fun thing to talk about if you are all interested in talking about that at some point. Then I did another startup, which was what we called application service provider. This is like hosted applications. It's what ultimately became software as a service, and then ultimately became the cloud. But it was way too early at that point in time. Sold that company to Red Hat. Did another company, which was how do we actually connect consumer electronics devices like your TV to the internet so that you could get content. And I ultimately sold that company to a company that became TiVo. Again, it was way too early. It's my story of all of my startups is basically way too early. Decent idea, but 5 years too early. Then I got a call from Netflix, and they're like, "Hey, we think we're doing what you were trying to go do at that last startup. Why don't you join us?" At this point in time, I don't know if anybody remembers, but Netflix was just mailing DVDs in these red envelopes out. That was the form of distribution at that point in time.
I remember that.
Yeah, exactly. Some folks in this room are old enough to remember that. But and then we were pivoting to doing that distribution over the internet. And so I joined to go do that. And then 17, 18 years later, I'm still there, much to my surprise.
So I love the remark you made earlier about how you were in the process at Netflix of like disrupting yourself in some sense, and I wonder if you could talk about a little bit what that dynamic was like inside the company.
Yeah, we had a very strong belief that essentially, you get successful, and calling Netflix successful in the DVD era, you could argue it's all relative, but we had beaten Blockbuster, which was this physical stores where you would go in and rent video cassette tapes and then DVDs. Really dating ourselves here, but we'd beaten them, and that was seen as like an incredible success. And I think when you have that level of success, you start to think, one, you've got a lot to protect, so you are, less willing to take risks. And then also you build in a little bit of complacency and arrogance. And so one of the things that we really inculcated at this point in time is that we have got to go disrupt ourselves. So what's the next thing that's going to happen, or what's the industry shift? And obviously streaming and digital distribution through the internet was a thing. And so we were like, we have got to be the people that disrupt ourselves. So we had this mantra that everything that we did on the streaming side, if it wasn't hurting us on the DVD distribution side, we weren't being aggressive enough, because somebody else was willing to go there, instead of us, especially somebody that didn't have anything to lose, so to speak. And to the point where actually, as soon as we started seeing real signals that the streaming business was going, was the time was now, was ready, was moving, we actually cleaved off all of the DVD people and said, you are no longer coming to the management meetings anymore. You can go off and do a separate thing, which was quite provocative from the internal management of the company, because these are the people that were essentially, had built this other thing, and they were the status quo, power leaders in the company. But we made that shift.
How much porosity was there in terms of people who were able to make the shift along with you?
I would say a reasonable number, because Inside the company, you mean, right?
Yeah.
Because we had key things like our recommendation systems that we're doing recommendations for the DVD, titles that we brought over to do that. The folks who were doing the website we brought over. So, it was a good probably 60%. But 40% of the company that's been building this thing for a while. That hey, essentially it was equivalent to saying you're second-class citizens now. It was a tough move.
Mm-hmm. What would you say is, it feels like AI is kind of disrupting every business out there, but, what would you say is your current move in this direction in the sense that how are you disrupting yourself now as opposed to before?
Yeah, I think, part of this is also knowing what role you play in the value chain, because I think it's another thing that in my, sort of my model, companies try and do way too much where they feel like we can do everything essentially. And partly you have to know what space you're in. And also what part of the value chain is the durable competitive advantage that you can own. So for example, I don't believe that we should be foundational model builders. That's just not who we are, right? There's so many people that are investing, I was going to say hundreds of billions, but maybe moving into trillions of zones, and so that's just not a role that we need to play, because we can access that work via commercial models or open source models. And so, so our role is really, when I think about what's the advantage we've got at scale consumer products, at scale distribution. We've got at scale business processes like content production. Our job should be aggressive adopters of the technology, take the foundational components, figure out what specific things that we can add to it, essentially mostly like what gigantic, well-ordered data sets that we can use essentially to polish those models and then have them be very specific to what we need to go deliver. So that's the role that we need to play. And so that's sort of from us, from a company perspective, that's how I really see, ensuring that we're, disrupting ourselves versus giving somebody else the opportunity to go do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of the folks in this room are, exploring this sort of inflection point themselves in terms of, their own content generation, dare I talk about a taboo subject, but how these tools are being used to sort of create. And you were talking earlier today about, the ways that you're sort of moving those tools into your workflows in terms of your actual content, but there's still some limitations from what I understand.
Yeah, well, you say it's interesting, it's a taboo subject, right? For me, I don't think it should be a taboo subject. I think, our job is to think about all the tools that we have available to us and how do we create amazing output with all the tools. And if those tools can help you do a better job, that's amazing. And so obviously if using those tools replace actually learning what you're doing, that's a bad thing. But, if you want to use them, I think you should. We'll offer no formal position for Yale University, but my take is that, certainly for our take, we want our employees to use these things. So I'm also a firm believer that there's no line of sight based on what I am seeing on, a sort of, an artificial intelligence model actually being the force of innovation and the force of creation. I still see this as being, there's humans at the center of these things. They're going to be able to do their work in more efficient, more compelling ways, produce more as a result. And I'm super excited about that. But I still think it's going to be the human at the center. And I don't see any indication that that's going to change. So again, our mantra is great. Let's go figure out how to use those tools. And it's super, it's fascinating to see where the tools are strong and where the tools are weak. And I would say, just as like an example, when you're going through, the process of creating, let's say, a video or a song, the ideation part, it's amazing what these tools can do, right? They're great ways to try things out really quickly and sort of get a sense for what's going on. But then when you actually have, when you produce something and you're going from, the ideation phase into what we call it, say, production pixels on the video side, sometimes can be remarkably difficult to get exactly what you want out of the model in a deterministic way, because of the nature of what they are. And so us understanding there's a blended approach between, these new techniques, more classical deterministic techniques that you use, and you have to use them in the right spaces, is sort of where we're sort of seeing how this works.
Mm-hmm. Do you have, and then I want to come back to sort of how, again, a little more on your background in terms of how it trained you to do what you do. Do you have thoughts in terms of the way, you mentioned taking a position on what Yale University should do. I think we're all in the faculty really interested in how to kind of productively navigate our curricula and the way we think about instruction into embracing rather than sort of trying to keep at arm's length all of these sort of generative tools. Do you have any thoughts for us as we move into thinking about new curricula?
Yeah, I'll start by saying I'm dangerously underinformed to be offering an opinion in this space. But my general take is, again, you want to use everything, right? We don't actually, at the end of the day, I have a particular point of view on this, which is hopefully this experience is preparing you to go do amazing things in the world. And doing things in the world means that you use all the tools that you have available to you to go produce stuff that has value and merit. And so you want to learn how to essentially use those tools and be good at that process. And so my general orientation is open it up, but then, try and assess on the output. So, did you figure out how to use that tool well? Do you understand when the tool is giving you pablum or when the tool is giving you something that's relevant? How do you, extend beyond that and make it something that's actually rich and novel? That's the way I would think about it.
Mm-hmm. Good. All right, we'll give it a try. In terms of your background in physics and astronomy, I mean, it didn't exactly send you into thinking about being a physicist or being an astronomer, right? So did it set you up in some critical way? As a mathematician, I'm interested.
Yeah, it was that was maybe my original plan, that was the thing I was going to go do.
Oh, okay.
I thought my general thought, this is my life plan, was like, okay, join the Air Force, become an astronaut, and then transition back to the academy at some point in time to do research. That's what I was thinking. I did my senior thesis, and it was basically, how do you get energy out of the nuclear furnace of the center of the star to the edge of the star? It's so dense, it's actually really hard to get the energy out. And so there was this theory about some fluid dynamics that I built a sort of computer model to assess whether or not that was there, and proved that it was a marginal contributor to getting energy out. So my thesis advisor at the time said, that's great. You've basically eliminated this as a possibility. I said, it doesn't feel great. Actually, for me, I felt like I spent a year, doing something that didn't really add much. And so that's when I realized I needed a tighter loop in terms of what, I was putting my effort into and building and seeing something as a result. So that's when I decided it's probably not the best, path for me. But I would say this, as a physics major, I didn't really do a lot of physics in my career. There was some orbital mechanics stuff that was potentially, quasi-relevant, but mostly it was a lot of engineering at the end of the day. It's actually building stuff, dealing with crazy engineering disciplines from thermal in space to a lot of, increasingly software stuff. And so mostly the physics piece was just, teaching me fundamental principles that allowed me to learn new parts of engineering, and be, effective in talking to deep experts in that space, and then sort of compositing all that, synthesizing it, and building something as a result. That was, I think, super, super important. And the other part that was super important is that my broader experience at Yale, I took a bunch of film courses, for example, or all the general education stuff that I did made me, a somewhat competent interlocutor to a bunch of different domains, which didn't know anything about the technical space, but that the collaboration between these two things was super important to actually advancing whatever goal we had. And the ability to speak film, somewhat credibly to the people that, that do that for a living, and then be able to say, okay, this is, how we can basically bring more technical attributes to what you're doing, became pretty powerful. And I actually really believe that there's a lot of value in the conjunction of those spaces.
So in terms of, your advice to this community and to how we're thinking about the structure of a Yale education, I mean, would that be your sort of defense of the Yale liberal arts model in particular? Or, I feel like when I speak to you guys, I have the sense that, you're really excited to be at Yale, but there's always, when we're talking to prospective students, the more classical engineering schools that are really going to focus on technical skills as a potential draw. So I'm interested always in hearing from alums who've been successful about why the Yale experience in particular was, or how you view it in terms of your preparation and training.
Yeah, I think just a point of reference too, and how I think about answering that question, was my personal experience here, which I think is different than what a lot of you are experiencing, where I didn't get hardly any practical components when I was here. Essentially, the computer science courses that Yale offered at this point in time were like completely theoretical and very marginally, helpful in being practical.
Still true? No? Okay, good.
It's like a little. There might be a sliver of
nobody
that
quite wants to own that one.
Yeah, so maybe some more progress to be had, but for me, I was somewhat fortunate in the sense that my mom was one of the first women that was admitted to the analyst program at IBM. So she learned how to be a software developer way back in the day. So I grew up with coding in a very informal, non-rigorously academic sense. So I sort of knew how to get my hands dirty, and I just taught myself essentially, through the whole process. But I think it would have been better, it would have been more helpful to me if there was essentially a bridging from this theoretical space into the more practical space. But having said that, that general education was incredibly valuable too, right? And so probably I would say if I had to, I wouldn't give up the general just to close that gap practical. And I think we can do better. I think we can provide both that and more practical, and maybe a little bit improvement from what we're seeing today even. But and maybe there's an opportunity to bridge it more directly into industry specifically. Because I really do, I really believe, I would say I've had a great amount of fun and satisfaction and reward from actually going out and building stuff in the world. I think that's pretty amazing, especially stuff that millions and millions of people use. And I would think that it'd be great to give that opportunity to lots of people.
Yeah, I my feeling when we were here was that this idea that you were going to do something practical was almost frowned upon a little bit.
Definitively, right?
Completely. Right.
It was seen almost as like a, who would want to do that versus, knowledge
so
for knowledge sake.
Yeah,
right?
and yet I feel like when you guys are coming in now, you have the sense of, the Yale education is this precious thing, but that part of it is like setting you up to go do your next thing. Like you're already thinking past it in a way. And so, I'm kind of interested when you run into me on the street and hearing like, what could we be doing differently to sort of set you up in that way and set you on a path towards something? So let's see, there's one or two other things. Do you think that the sort of entrepreneurial emphasis that we're starting to see in a lot of different programs around the country is something we should kind of embrace or sort of hold at bay? In terms of, technical is a little different from entrepreneurial.
For sure, but I think, look, you're going to get, give my background. It's obvious the answer I'm going to give. I think it's super important. It's how we get stuff done. I'm a huge fan of the fact that we renew and that we challenge the status quo and we move forward, because we have people that are willing to take risks and willing to shuffle off orthodoxy and to challenge all the things that are associated with it. And, creating, systems that basically help people get to that point to explore that. It's not right for everybody, right? But to be able to understand if it's right for them, I think is super helpful to individuals and to society.
And was there any aspect of that process for you that you wished you'd had some kind of formal training, or was it just that everybody was kind of learning on the fly and you were picking things up like you did coding?
Yeah, I had, again, this is sort of personal advantage. My father was sort of a entrepreneur, even without the label of entrepreneur. He was just more like, you might call him an itinerant business person, who got bored and wanted to do something new and find something. And, so I sort of had that informal training a little bit, almost like the companion piece to my, software development side of things. But I do think, there is, not surprisingly, there are multiple ways to be successful as an entrepreneur, but there are like a bunch of best practices and sort of things you can learn. There's like network advantages, obviously, that you can get. So there's a ton of stuff that you can give people that, is scaffolding to get to a better place more quickly. And so I do think that that's a huge advantage. And, and again, those things have been, where there's commercial versions of those that people are, have built and that have been proven to be quite effective, I'd say as well.
I think one of the other things that we wrestle with is how to make it okay for students, and we have this kind of nice protected space, but to take risks and to sort of learn about that it's okay to do so. Was there sort of a particular moment where you, in your sort of pathway where you were like, well, I don't know if this is going to work out, but I'm going to try it anyway?
I've been on that moment many times, and sometimes you could argue it didn't work. I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes it didn't work out, right? So, yeah, I mean, thousands of times. Like, so, my two startups, before, Netflix, essentially both, I mean, we exited, but it wasn't a success, at the end of the day. It's essentially a fire sale of assets because you can't fund it anymore. So that's a slap in the face, right? You're like, oh, that sucks. And trying to do one of those during the dot-com bust was rough, so you're laying off people and trying to figure out how you cash flow the company. And, so I've definitely been knocked around. There's no doubt. And even just doing simple things like at Netflix, right? So one of the things I try and remind people is that, a lot of folks that especially come into the company now sort of have this expectation of what Netflix is. We operate at tremendous scale, tremendous quality. All eyes are on us. We're, the entertainment experience of, hundreds of millions of people depend on how we do. And I think that's true, and that's great. And we have to take that very, very seriously. But we also need to try new things. And when you try new things, you're not very good at it. And you oftentimes, fall on your face because that's how you learn. And so I was reminded by a student I was talking to today about the Tyson-Paul fight. Does anybody remember this? This is an example where we put on, one of the very first live events that we did. We had a sort of a range of estimates for how many people were going to join the stream, which was an order of magnitude, just to be clear, so it was an incredibly wide range. And then we actually exceeded the top end of that by 4x. And so, we had systems that were, either falling down or hanging on, by a thread. And, it was not the experience that we wanted to deliver to everyone at the end of the day. But it was incredibly successful because we proved that we could pull off an event that was gigantic in size. So that was helpful to put us on the map in that regard. And we learned so much about what do we need to do to scale the systems to handle this kind of stuff that it would have taken us 2 years to learn that all if we sort of iteratively walked up that path. So I was so as the team was sort of like, gosh, that sucked. And, all my friends are like, how come you guys are supposed to be great engineers? How could this, suck so much? I'm like, this is great, because 12 months from now, nobody will really remember what happened, but they'll remember not only the fact that we pulled off this amazing event, but the 20 other events that we did since then have been all perfect. And so, you got to be willing to get out there and to get embarrassed a bit, because that's the way you learn.
Yeah, I think, we kind of get here by coloring in the lines to some extent. And so I think like that learning process where you sort of break down some of that risk aversion is really key. Okay, so I want to open it up. Here's one of us. So ask him some hard questions.
Only older.
So here, let me get a microphone.
We're going to do mics around here?
Where did they go?
We can maybe start here, and then if you tell it, I can give it back to the audience. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. Okay, here we go. I have to memorize it. Yeah.
A bit ago, I remember Netflix staying the focus of a lot of online criticism when they announced that they were going to limit access when half sign-up websites sold.
Yep.
To crack down on password sharing. As the CEO, how do you take into account the feedback and sometimes criticism of the public, such as all the people saying that they were going to cancel their subscriptions in response to this, versus the internal company models and thoughts?
Okay, so this is about password sharing crackdown and how do you do that. Who actually got impacted by the Netflix? Okay, yeah, there we go. That's what I thought. I mean, note that there's a little bit of a selection with this audience particularly, but
I didn't raise my hand.
Yeah, right, fair enough. So, how do you deal with this kind of situation, right? I think you start by realizing that it's a pretty imperative condition for the business to try and figure out how does it get reasonably paid for the services that it's offering, right? And you all maybe are in the position of you had parents or something like that, and now you're, but there were other people around the planet who were sharing their password with 50 other people, and we're charging each of those people, let's say a 30% of our charge. So like a very commercial, what I would characterize as fraud situation. So there's a wide range of and then there were the folks who were like, hey, my grandmother wants to watch this show and I want to help my grandmother do it. Let me just help my grandmother do it, right? So you had a real range of like, sort of rationales or motivations behind what was happening. I think a real need to sort of try and figure out how do we make that work for the business. So then first thing you do is you got to say like, this is super important. We got to do it well. So we went through a process of debating different solutions. Ultimately, we built two totally independent approaches for this, launched both of them one in half the countries in Latin America, and the other half of the countries of Latin America. Poor Latin America got to be the test ground for this, but then you got tons of feedback essentially, and you say, how do you the internet can be a noisy space, but very often the signal that you get there is a narrow signal. It doesn't really represent the broad population out there. And so where you can, I think, understanding underneath that noise through a more rigorous approach, testing the actual behavioral responses of people when you present them the issues, following it up with qualitative analysis that understands what did they think about this, is a much more important kind of set of signals to operate from. So then once you figured out this is the thing you got to go do, then you try and present it honestly, and I think the worst thing you can do is lie to people or position to people what you're doing, which is like, you have to say what it is. This is why we think this is important. This is what we did. This is what's going to happen to you. Here are the choices you have to make. You have to honor and respect the fact that one of the choices they can make is say like, I don't want to, I'm canceling. And it's great. You make that easy. Give them the agency to go do that without friction. And at the end of the day, then you have to jump in and say, we're going to go do this, and we know it's going to be noisy, but we think it's the right thing to do, and we think we've done the work. Do you want to do that? All right, I got you. I'll let you steer then.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. I'm Nico. I'm an MBA candidate. I'm curious. Netflix hasn't gone the same way of some of the legacy media firms of really taking advantage of ancillaries, particularly products, experiences, licensing. It feels as if it's created culture defining IP that consumers would pay for those. I'm curious from your perspective why Netflix hasn't invested.
Yeah, probably two answers. One answer is a little bit a sequencing answer, which is understanding there's often like a path dependency or sequencing approach towards extending your businesses. And the way that I think about this is that, imagine you can do A or you can do B, right? Or maybe A then B or B then A. And very often doing one of those first is really critical because there's a time to market advantage, or, doing A then B means that B will be much more successful, right? And so, often ask questions like, okay, like if we are under realizing our consumer products and experience value because we have so much great IP, that's a great problem to have. Then at that point you do that and you build into it, and it's a fine situation to be in. And if you waited 2 years too long, it's probably not going to, ruin the business. But maybe the other one is what we call don't build the lemonade stand in front of the gold mine. And that's really trying to focus on the things that are going to be most material to the business, and even things that you can do, and you can slam it out of the park, and you can add a couple $100 million of revenue here. There's a creeping distraction and attention tax for those things. And so those things have to earn their place. And if you have the gold mine, the thing that's a super high leverage that ultimately you believe, will be worth billions and billions and billions, don't spend too much time building a lemonade stand. Really just focus on making the gold mine bigger.
Yeah. Someone in the back.
Hey, Greg. My name is Kanan. I'm an electrical engineering and computer science student. I was wondering, I got to work in the satellites and space industries before. So I was wondering what business insights and lessons you learned from your time at those industries. Thank you.
Well, I guess one, just note that from the time when I was working in it to today, it's a completely different universe, right? We were talking back then when I was doing it, $100,000 per kilo to get to low Earth orbit, right? Now we're gonna, I think, approach $200 per kilo to get to LEO. That's incredible, right? So that just changes the whole atmosphere. So, I mean, it changes the whole engineering approach too, right? Because the engineering approach we had back then was like hyper bespoke, double check everything, systems redundancies up the wazoo. We had clean room implementations of software. So you had the primary flight software, and you had a completely separate team independently implement the same software so you could do a comparison check across a range of conditions. So crazy expensive. And now satellite production looks more like consumer electronics manufacturing, where it's high volume. You basically just fail out stuff. You don't worry about it too much. So I think actually, for me, the thing that I would be thinking about is, how do you think about mass production kind of approaches towards space, which I think is an amazing place for the human race to be in. But that'd be the angle that I would take.
Someone over here, maybe? I don't know.
Thank you so much for coming. Reed Hastings at Netflix in general has kind of been outspoken, and not outspoken, but has made a comment a few times about employees as professional athletes rather than looking at them more as, family members or some of the other approaches to that. How do you think about, value maximizing with your employees versus building the trust over a long-term period?
Well, I think trust is super important. And I say we don't believe that the two statements that Reed made, the sports team, model and trust, are opposed. So you can actually achieve both. Now you have to be, we actually take a sort of intentional approach towards building trust. So we think about multiple different ways that we encourage, relationships, closeness amongst the team, and then a strong, sense of trust. And the best way, frankly, though, to build trust is you actually give teams, projects that they work together on that are successful, because that, at the end of the day, is when they trust each other that they can do this again and again and again. But we also say, hey, recognize that we are in the high performance game. And that means that, we think about, all of us have to earn our place on the team. And if somebody's ultimately not earning the place on the team, then we have to swap them out for somebody else. We want to make that a one explicit, condition or understanding, so that we all are coming in with the same sense of what's going to happen. And then we want to make sure that when that situation happens, we handle it with super respect. And we understand that, it's not a failure of the person typically. Really, these are great people that are trying really, really hard. But, the demands of the position, as we think about it in the sports team analogy, have exceeded their capability, and we need to make a change. And so we celebrate them going out, and then we invite somebody in, and then we try and, build trust with them and move on. But I think the main thing I hear when we talk about our culture, when people talk about our culture outside, is they think it's like cutthroat, internally competitive, people and it's completely not that at all. But it's also coming in with a strong recognition that, not all of us will be with the company for our entire lives. And that's part of what we're doing. Did that answer your question, or? Okay. All right, good.
Take your pick. Yeah. That's good.
Hi, thank you for taking the time to be here. So I remember when I was a kid, I would log into Netflix and I'd find like whatever movie I wanted. And then as the years went by, there was Disney, there was Amazon Prime, and all of a sudden you have to have like subscriptions to all these different services. So in terms of business strategy, looking back, did you guys see this coming? And in hindsight, like what would you do to prepare, and maybe what you could have done to maybe the situation play out differently?
Yeah, so it's interesting because you sort of see the industry and, analyze it from a first principles perspective. And when we were doing streaming, we saw so much success. We're like, okay, this is going to get copied. It's going to happen. There's no doubt that folks are going to come after us. I mean, shockingly, in some sense, it took 10 years for that to happen in earnest. Amazon was definitely there with us. You had Hulu, but it was a confused, structure. But to get, all the main folks to do Paramount, to do Warner's, to do just like that, took them literally 10 years to respond. But what was great is, in the meantime, it allowed us essentially to do what I think you're getting at, which is that we said, we anticipate a day when they're all going to realize that this is the thing that the people are going to want. They're going to all move this direction. And when they do, because they are now the people that are licensing content to us, they're going to say, no, we'll keep this content for our own service. And so that's when we basically started our originals program, where we're basically doing our own production so that we could create an independent source of supply, creator relations where we were competing with creators to build, to produce their titles essentially before they went to Disney, before they went to Warner. And we fortunately had a long enough runway that actually when, that moment happened, we had actually a reasonable amount of content that was still available to folks. Now, having said that, I do think that there is going to be some consolidation and shakeout. You already see it happening, with moves that have been happening recently. So I think that's inevitable, and I think that'll sort of rationalize the industry some more.
Over.
Hi, thanks for talking to us today. I think the co-CEO model is quite unique, especially in a company of Netflix's size. So could you take us through sort of the anatomy of what a disagreement between you and your co-CEO looks like? And then I suppose the following question is, who does the buck really stop with? How does Netflix answer that question?
Yep. So just one point, before we went to the co-CEO model, we looked at sort of the historical performance of companies that co-CEO, non-co-CEO for total shareholder return. And essentially, it sorts into two, distribution buckets. One is massively underperform and one is significantly overperform. And then you qualitatively analyze the two buckets and you find that, folks that have had the co-CEO model put on them, fail usually. And then folks that are sort of actively supporters of the model and think of it as a competitive advantage as individuals tend to succeed quite well. Not a shocker given sort of human personalities. So I would say, back to the architecture, what does it look like? Part of what we seek to do is actually minimize the downsides of the co-CEO model, which you could think about sort of latency in decision making because it takes time for two people to coordinate, or even worse, let's say you had people shopping for a decision between CEOs or those kind of things, political gain, all that kind of stuff. And then you're also trying to optimize the benefits. And the benefits are that, especially because in our company, we sort of bring two very distinct worlds together, the creative content production world and the product technology analytical world. And there's really companies that are very strong at both, one or the other, let's say, but not any company, I think, other than us that's incredibly good at the scale we're at both. And so to some degree, the co-CEO architecture represents that. And so what you're trying to optimize is that for those decisions that fundamentally, are better because you bring both of those perspectives in, you really want to honor the opportunity for both centers of expertise to weigh in. So how do you do those? How do you achieve that? Partly is recognize that 95% of decisions don't require that deep kind of strategic insight. And a lot of them happen essentially strongly in the technology arm or the product arm or strongly in the content arm. So then you sort of divvy the world up and say, we can move quickly, almost like it was a single CEO model within those domains for the large majority of those decisions. And then the thing you need to go do is figure out which of those decisions actually matter at the top level strategic point and really benefit from both perspectives. And then you need to create enough time, to sort through and to work it out. You ask the hardest question because it intellectually feels like, wow, how do you do this? Let's say both then CEOs just disagree. One of those top level strategic questions, and just I think A, you think B. How do you resolve that? At the end of the day, we didn't think that any formal mechanism like appeal to the chair or the board, that was a failure case in our mind. So what we said is, it is on us to basically, whenever we get in that situation, to sort it out until we come to one position. And I would say, as intellectually unsatisfying as that probably sounds, it's been effective so far. So I would say, we'll talk in 10 years and see if we still are doing a good job. But I think if you carry that moral obligation and you come in with that perspective, it actually changes the dynamic of the conversation too, right? Because it forces you to get to okay, there's something that you're seeing or some assumptions that you have that I'm missing. So let's at least get to the bottom of that. And then you get to okay, are those assumptions correct? Are those priors valid? How would we assess that? How would we challenge that? And if you're seeing these tough decisions far enough ahead, you have the time to sort through that. And again, so far it's worked.
That's a great answer. I wanted to get this person way up in the back. She's been raising her hand.
Thank you. My name is Amelia Weiler. I am a sophomore, and I'm studying mechanical engineering and philosophy. And I have two questions, one related to Netflix, one related to your time at Yale.
Yep.
And first off, when I came to Yale, I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many opportunities. You can do so much. And it was honestly overwhelming. So I'm wondering if somebody who's interested in kind of pursuing a career that's similar to yours, what would you think is the best way to capitalize on our time here? I have 2 more years or 2.5. So what are somebody that's going to talks, talking with professors, making connections? What's some advice that you have? And then for the Netflix question, it's more about cultural homogeneity.
Yep.
And how big hit movies are now being globalized, streamed everywhere. And if you personally have any fears of that, just sort of making everyone start wearing blue jeans and white t-shirts and becoming the same across different countries. And just on a personal level, how is Netflix going to handle that? And also, when you go to a new country in the middle of Africa, it's emerging market, you bring Wi-Fi and you realize that a lot of people are spending time watching cat videos or entertainment. And what do you see and what are your fears on that as well? Because that seems like one of the problems with Netflix and products.
Okay. A lot of good questions. Wow. Okay, let me see if I could take it. Okay, so I did a lot of random things, just things that I was interested in pursuing at Yale that had nothing to do with sort of my thinking career. I just this would be fun. Sort of close analysis of film or what are other things? Anyway, so my general sense is just pursue what is interesting to you. I think that has tremendous value because one, it allows you just to explore different spaces. And I think a lot of us don't know what we're interested in because we just haven't tried all sorts of things. And so the more that you can try, the more experimental you can be. I think that's great. And the more you can just put yourself out there and not really worry about what the consequences are, that seems like a great way to learn. Okay, so then it was cultural homogeneity. Is that the next one? Okay, great. Maybe not surprisingly, I have a more positive view on this than maybe is implied by your question. I think that we are creating opportunities for storytellers and creators to tell their stories and find global audiences that would have never had that opportunity before. They would have never been embraced by essentially, the 1 or 2 places, Hollywood and maybe you can argue England, that actually you can produce global stories from. And so now, whether it's Squid Game, whether it's, Casa de Papel, there's just so many examples of stories that we've brought from places that would have never been global stories before. Sorry, Casa de Papel is Money Heist, in case people didn't, but that's, so they are now essentially, they're global hits. And you can argue that maybe that's just a different kind of homogeneity, but I actually think it's different. I think it's it's unlocking perspectives into different parts of the world that wouldn't have been able before. So I'm enthusiastic by that. That doesn't mean that you're not going to see a ton of K-pop Demon Hunter costumes and stuff like that. So when these things get big, people celebrate it, and that moment will be a global moment increasingly. But I think that's okay because it also balances out the other thing that I think you're seeing in entertainment, which is very, very specific, very targeted, niche, personalized, right? And so that has incredible power. And then the other side has incredible power too, because it's a shared conversation. It's a shared moment for us. Sorry, then your third question was, UGC cat videos. How do we think about that as a competitive threat? Is that right?
Not competitive, more just
Yeah, well, that's a form of competition, right? In some sense, time and attention. Well, I guess, yeah, no, it's a fair point. I think we humans have always sought entertainment and storytelling, right? It's, a deep tradition. And so I do think there is something that in the human condition that needs that. We seek it out. We hope and would say, and you could probably argue with this depending on which title you're talking about, but that we fulfilled that in a very, in a positive, aspiring way that, is ideally trying to operate towards the acme of human creativity versus cat videos. But I think it's part of what humans need. And so I think it's a balance of human life. It's a source of inspiration. Sometimes it's a source of escapism and just sort of balancing out the other things that we have in life. But it's also back to your culture of homogeneity question. It's a form of connection, and I think us seeing what other people in the world are experiencing is a pretty powerful, form of bringing us together, I hope. And storytelling is a great way to go do that. And art has always served as a Trojan horse to some degree for some of these, for societal critique and evolution. And I still think that'll be the case. And I think that's pretty important.
All right. I'm going to try to get over here. Yeah, here we go. Hands been up for a while.
You brought up earlier about your time like in the entrepreneurial space during the dot-com burst.
Yep.
Right, and you also mentioned AI. Do you think that right now we're in an AI bubble?
Yeah. There's no doubt in my mind that we're in a bubble. So there's two questions that are relevant maybe in that, which is like, actually bubbles can be quite good. So bubbles serve a purpose. And I think that we will see, I believe, the benefits of being in a bubble because we will build a bunch of stuff that'll serve, humanity well for a long period of time. Similar to the internet bubble, which, a lot of stuff got built that we've leveraged for, decades post that moment. A lot of, the next question is like, okay, then the bubbles burst. And what happens when the bubble bursts, right? And the question is how wide a blast radius is that and how many people get, impacted by it. From a lot of this gets to like how much of this is debt financed and, how big the consequences are. Unlike in the internet era, we have been essentially mostly cash flow financing the investments that we're making today. That's starting to move a little bit more into debt. And so you can start to argue that it's getting a little bit more interesting now. But quick answer is, I don't know exactly how I don't know when it's gonna burst. I don't know exactly what the blast radius is, but I'll bet, anything you want that it will burst. It's just a matter of when. So, but I think it's going to be, I do also think that, we will benefit from this bubble activity for a long time to come. And a lot of people will lose a bunch of money. Investors will lose a bunch of money in the process. So.
Speaking of risk, right? Yeah. Maybe time for one more. Up here, the American flag.
Woo!
Hi, I'm Ravza. I'm from the School of Management. My question is very similar to the question that's been asked. What would your biggest advice would be to someone who's building in the AI era now that everything is more possible and faster to build and iterate, different than the dot-com bubble? So how would you suggest that we navigate this bubble like the most efficiently?
Well, one which probably is easy because I think it's your natural inclination, which is like lean into the tools, use them, figure out how to be proficient in them. I think, you having a deep understanding of what the tools are good at and what they're not good at, that's to some degree an advantage, right? And that will give you an advantage over the people that don't necessarily have that. I think there's an open question around craft building and, like becoming an expert in a space and how does that work in this new era? Because a lot of that used to be by doing, call it the ditch digging work, right? That younger people coming into industry would do, and they would learn how to be experts as a result. I think it's an open question around how that works now, but I actually have great faith that, motivated folks who are leaning into that will actually will basically, those tools will enable them to learn how to be experts, and not only experts, but experts in the new world of using those tools. So I think, rapid experimentation and iteration is the way to go. Try a bunch of things, leverage the fact that you can try 50 ideas in the time it would have taken you to try 2, 20 years ago. I think, experimentation, you learn a lot. So I'd emphasize the velocity of experimentation and learning would be my main advice.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Greg, thank you very much.
Yep.
You're not an engineer, but you're today an honorary engineer. Thanks so much for coming. Hang around for the reception outside, and maybe he'll even let you take a selfie with him.
Absolutely.
So thank you so
Thanks
much for coming.